Point? Now, hear the Counterpoint on Libertarian Counterpoint podcasts.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. With me is John Cameron and our special guest, my boss here at the show, Mr. Gail Morgan. Gentlemen, we didn't cover to it last week, so I'm going to get to it this week. There was a Time article in about the secret campaign to save the elections. Now, that's actually a nice little euphemism here. And it's actually very well written because I got to almost the end of it before I kind of realized that, hey, wait a minute, if somebody else had running around and secretly strengthened the elections, changing the way we vote and campaign laws all behind the scenes and secretive, people would have had a cow. But now all of a sudden they're patting themselves on the back for making sure that they got a result they wanted. It's a bit disturbing how open they are about it. It's I don't know. It seems strange to me.
I have a theory, like I have about things I haven't even heard of yet. I'm actually hoping that the writer wrote it in the way he wrote it to expose to make it, because the people on the left are so absolutely sure, and I'm not going to call them liberals because we all know the classic definition of liberal, and they ain't it. We call them National Socialists, except for they finally figured out that's what Nazi Germany was and stopped calling themselves that. But if you look, again, I agree. If people on the right would have published something like this, there would be, the world would be up in arms. There would be rioting. There would be demands for the election to be overturned, for recounts, for people involved to go to prison, for some of them to be shot for treason. I mean, the uproar would be calamitous, and the insidious nature of those people are so certain that their viewpoint is correct, and that anything that will help them achieve their goals is morally not bankrupt, that it makes me sick to my stomach. And it reminds me, in no small way, of what we used to say when we looked at quote unquote elections in communist China and the Soviet Union before it fell, and in puppet regimes in South America, and in military in Africa, and all the rest of that, where a group of people got together and preordained, in essence, the outcome of the election, made it impossible for the opposition to get the word out, suppressed any opposing viewpoints, and made it easier for there to be election fraud. And they're stating that they made it easier for people to vote, but because of all the things they put in place to get people out to vote without any barriers to their voting, the logical consequence of that is that a lot of those votes could very well be not qualified. So I could go on and on and on, literally for the whole show about this. But I was disgusted by seeing it, and what disgusted me most, and this is why I'm hoping it's almost tongue in cheek by the reporter, although I don't think it is, because that side is so certain that they're in the right that they'll do anything. I was literally nauseous as I was reading it. What do you guys think?
Well, I think it's the mindset is actually what's dangerous. If these things needed to happen to strengthen the election, then why can't you be open about it?
So, I'm going to take a little bit different stance on it, because who does the yelling, John? It's the same people that are saying, well, we did this. There's nobody left to yell because the Republicans have not been confrontational at all. The closest they came was Trump for 4 years, and I'm not sure how much a Republican Trump is or was, because he was a Democrat all the way up until he got elected, before he ran, I should say.
Yeah.
And their whole philosophy is, hey, If you don't like it, yell and scream. And if you like the results, don't say anything. It's all quiet, covered up. Don't say anything. And it's the same people making the noise if they don't like it. But if they, as they say, the end justifies the means. If they got what they wanted, it's okay if they break the rules. And as far as preordained elections, I ran for the assembly. I believe it was in 2006, maybe somewhere around there. I discovered at that point the Democrat Party not only runs the local elections here, but before the election takes place, they already know who's going to win. And when the city council gets the people in their seats, they quickly decide which of those city council members is going to move up to the assembly, which one's going to go to the Senate. This is determined after their first elect, or possibly before they're even elected to city council. They know they already know who's going to be the next assemblyman from the Sacramento area. This is all preordained. And having run for the assembly at that time, and there was six Democrats, one Republican, and one Libertarian in that race. And so in the primary, it was the Democrat contest, and oh yeah, we'll let these two guys speak. And pretty soon I picked up on that kind of the mode of things. And so I started addressing the big picture of everybody and singling out one of the Democrats to pick on him and attack one of his positions. And it went from being we favor gay marriages to while we favor gay marriages, we would never force a church to perform them. And I tackled one item for each debate, and I made Dave Jones change his presentation at every one of those because I would pick on something and he would adapt it for the next debate. Anyway, come November, David Jones was not taking any interviews or debates or anything. Therefore, the news media would not interview and talk to myself or the Republican.
So you're the reason we can't talk to assembly people around here. Can't get any discussions with debates with assembly people around here. But it's the political machine.
Primary.
Yeah, the political machine does exist. And it's that political machinery that is what we actually have to fight. And one of the things I realized in the campaign is how much grift essentially exists. And this whole shadow campaign is essentially a bunch of people who are grifting off the system, protecting their grift.
Well, and I think I'm starting to see a phrase bandied about that I really like, and it's the political class. And quite frankly, it doesn't matter. I think you can drive like maybe a razor blade in between Republicans and Democrats, except on two issues that they raised the rabble about. If people are convinced that these two parties represent a difference in government, then they throw their means and their energy behind these two parties. But when these parties are elected, the reality is that the future looks exactly the same, no matter who's elected, Republican or Democrat. But they've convinced the voters that they have to make a choice of either Republican or Democrat. I mean, I call them lots of names, but they are exactly the same party because they are the political class.
You know what the difference is, John?
What?
You know what the serious difference between them is? There's one thing that stands out between them. The Democrats hate Republicans, while the Republicans despise Democrats. And that is the major difference that I find between the parties.
Yeah. Well, no, that's what I'm talking about. It's like it's like racism. I mean, there's no logical difference between the parties because the political machine survives. The people that are helping out I don't know whether you want to call it graft or you want to call it corruption or whatever you want to call it. The people who make their living from government make their living from government, no matter what government is in power. And it's the status quo. And as long as the voting public is convinced that there is a difference between the two, and I don't know why they are based upon the outcomes, they will pick one of those two to get behind and nothing will ever change, which is why libertarians are now doing something. They're taking a page from political history, which is they're running for school boards and they're running for local assembly and they're running for all the rest of that. And I think I might take a shot at the school board here on the plank of just being an outrageous voice against the power of teachers unions, which means that the teachers unions will throw all of its weight behind me. I don't even have a kid in school, but I live in an area of Sacramento where people have to can't send their kids to, well, unless they have means, they have to send their kids to Sacramento, the Sacramento School District, which is horrible. I mean, it is just, it might be down there with Chicago and LA. So, I think we're learning as libertarians that what you have to do is grind away at the local level and get some power, amass some power, and then get into the assembly and get into the state senate, and then and on and on and on. It's unfortunate that the media foments this war between the Republicans and the Democrats as if there's a real difference between them when there isn't, because then people think that by voting for a Republican, they're voting against this guy in office that they despise everything about, or if you're a Democrat, for voting against this guy who's in office. But the one fact that about this major national election that blows my mind, and you can tell how biased the lamestream media is, or blamestream media. This guy Trump, who I believe is not a Republican by any stripe or means, he got more of the popular vote. He got more people voted for him than voted for Barack Obama. And this is in the middle of a pandemic with all of the media that puts out the messages being against the man, without with anything negative about his opponents being suppressed, and repeated lies about him. The New York Times is still posting Russian interference in the previous election. Russian interference in the previous election. There was no Russian interference in the previous election. And it was all a false flag operation that originated probably with Hillary Clinton. So if it hadn't been, this is the thing that they won't say, if it hadn't been for COVID, Donald Trump would have been elected by 20 points, and Republicans would have swept the House and the Senate, because it is, quite frankly, always about the economy. And if it hadn't been for COVID, none of the efforts of the National Socialist movement would have made any difference. But do you see that statement made, which is absolutely true? Nobody's observed politics who is speaking the truth would disagree with that. Is anybody saying that? No. They're acting as if a choice was made by people to vote against Mr. Trump and vote for this other guy because he represented a difference. And all he represented was the opposing party in an economic downturn. Okay, I'm off my rant. We can rant about something else. Yeah.
So Clinton identified it as, it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
And quite literally, Nancy Pelosi and her team ruined the economy in order to get their guy elected.
Yeah.
And I believe that 100%. When she said a few years into his term as president, we are for anything that he is against and against anything he is for. That pretty much summed up the following 3.5 years when she said that.
Well, I think we all have to remember that Hillary Clinton and the DNC and their pals in the media prop Trump up in the Republican primaries because they thought he'd be easier to run against. So
Well,
if they'd have just left Trump alone, we wouldn't have had him. So, there's that whole mess. But we're going to move on. The new allegations of Mr. Governor Cuomo over in New York City, who won an Emmy for his performances in his press conferences.
Yeah. Was that handed to him by his brother, who used to?
I don't know, but he won an Emmy for lying, which apparently those were performances. So I guess the Emmy was actually warranted.
Yeah, it's all acting.
Apparently it was. It was all made up.
Yeah, the numbers that have come out are just crazy. The amount of people who died, and 10,000 people died and they weren't reported in order to keep him looking good until after the new year. And then, we had to fix those numbers. And over 10,000 people died there while New York was doing its best practices ever that everybody should be following. And just ask Fauci.
Yeah, just ask him. Now, so they reported 10 or 12,000, and it turns out there might be another 5,000, and they purposefully prevented those numbers from being, what's the word I'm looking for, revealed. They stonewalled and refused to answer questions about them because they were worried that the Justice Department would sue them, which didn't happen, and I don't know why it didn't happen. And at the same time, all this is going on. Cuomo is being interviewed. Where's his brother on MSNBC or one of those? Is interviewing him and handing him softball, feeding him these nice little sweet pitches to hit, and it's an abomination. And fortunately, Cuomo is so arrogant that he gets in a fight with every single mayor of New York. And mayors of New York actually have, in the real world, actually a little more political power than the governor of New York. I don't like de Blasio. He's a racist. He's putting in quotas in these elite schools in New York so that fewer Asian kids can go to them. And then, basically putting racial quotas in. So I don't like him, but I do like the fact that he's going toe-to-toe with Cuomo. And the wonderful thing is that because of the lying and the stonewalling and all the rest of that, Cuomo could very well be stripped of his emergency powers. And I'm just wondering when, Governor Newsom here in California will be stripped of his emergency powers. Hopefully the recall will happen and he'll be stripped of all powers because, if you look around the country, the states that have done the best, and there's no difference in the number of deaths from the pandemic, where their economies have survived and thrived, have been ones where lockdowns didn't happen or happened. There were fewer lockdowns. There is no correlation causation between lockdowns and health successes. But there is certainly, and I think we're going to talk about unintended consequences a little later. I hope so. There are certainly some unintended consequences to the pandemic, where they looked at only one issue, which was this virus, which turns out 8 times as many people actually have it as have been tested positive. So it's about 60% of the population of the U.S. apparently been exposed to it, according to the CDC, their numbers. They didn't say 60%, but if you read in between the lines. But the unintended consequences, especially for people of color, Black, Hispanic, Asian, small businesses. Anyway, we can talk about that later. But it's just been horrible. And these dictatorial, typically Democratic governors, for the most part, I think they're all Democratic governors, who decided that they knew best and ignored science, not their made-up science, but real science, have crushed their economies and caused literally probably 10 million businesses to close forever. And I want to talk about their thinking, and I know they'll never say this. They don't care about small business owners because small business owners never vote Democrat. Once they're big enough and they need to grease the wheels, they vote Democrat. once they need to bribe elected officials. But small business people are libertarian, right-leaning. And so they're never going to get their votes, never going to get their money, all the rest of that. They don't care whether their business goes under, where all those people are unemployed, whether they lose their life savings. They do not care. So anyway, on to the next. I'm sorry, I'm ranting.
No, we'll actually combine. We'll combine a couple of our last two topics here. According to, I've got to go find it. Half of all small black businesses have been wiped out due to, they says COVID, but of course we know it's government action over COVID. And the New York Times has finally discovered that there's unintended consequences, as we were talking about, that, these actions of closing things down have actions far beyond trying to save the lives of people from COVID. You have people who are now dying from drug overdoses, and suicide rates have doubled.
Spousal abuse, neglect, malnutrition,
violence,
depression, on and on and on and on. And I want to say this again, because I say it every time we bring up the subject. I want to make sure it gets heard. According to the World Health Organization, the World Bank, probably any, and I hate those national organizations, but they have stated over and over and over and over again that lockdowns are not the solution. They do more harm than good, especially to children, especially to the poorest of the poor. 100 plus million people on this planet have been pushed because of the lockdowns, not because of COVID, but because of government ineptness dealing with COVID, into the poorest form of poverty. That's living on $1.98 a day or less. People who are in that group die like flies. So shame on all of these supposedly caring governments around the world that have used lockdowns to try to deal with a disease and shoved 100 million people into a form of poverty that they can't even comprehend.
So I'm going to bring that picture down a little tighter and just talk Sacramento, because I deal with some of the poorer population. I represent the people who live in public housing. I sit on the Sacramento Housing Redevelopment Commission, and specifically, I'm responsible for representing the residents in the county as opposed to in the city. But my view of what's happened in the last year is these people feel isolated. I've seen more deaths in the past year, and yet I don't know of a single person who has died of COVID. So those numbers are going up, but not realistically from COVID, maybe from the circumstances around it. And then I look in the community, and the major stores at Arden Mall have closed. Nordstrom is gone. So the people that were making a halfway decent wage in retail have lost their jobs. Sears is closing. They will be gone in 2 months. So they don't pay as well as Nordstrom maybe, but those people are gone. You go through downtown and midtown, there's a ton of stores that are all closed and gone. So it's definitely taking a toll. And I don't think that it's necessarily focused on any stratus other than the economic stratus. If you're financially well enough and connected, you're going to do okay. If you're not financially set, it's going to be terrible on you. And it's not. I'm not going to say there's any relation to skin color necessarily on that.
Well, I'm not saying it's intentional racism, but it is racism nonetheless. When our candidate for vice president spoke, Libertarian candidate for vice president, Spike Cohen, right? Cohen,
yeah.
One of the things he talked about was Joe's conversations with people, and his conversations with people as they went to door, basically in the ghetto. And those conversations, when he brought up police and police brutality and, defund the police and all the rest of that, conversations they had were different than what the mainstream media wants you to have. Those people know they need police to protect them because there's crime.
The left is promoting this wipe out the police and promoting the racism. It's not the liberals, it's the left.
Yeah. But the conversation, and I hope I didn't talk over you, Gail, the conversation he had points out why these black businesses are getting killed. The biggest barrier to people raising themselves up from poverty didn't exist 50 or 60 years ago. And basically it's licensing and regulation. Our parents, if they wanted to start a garage, would work on cars in their garage until they had enough money to put some money down on a garage. And they didn't need a certificate. They didn't need insurance. They didn't need to worry about all the environmental stuff and all the rest of that. Those barriers, if you're a white middle class person who can borrow some money from your grandmother, or throw $20,000 on a credit card, those things aren't barriers. But if you have no credit, no background, no education, all you're doing is willing to work hard, and the local cop will come shut you down because you're violating regulations, those are barriers. And that's why that black small businesses fail, because they didn't have the capital, they didn't have the access to banking, all the rest of that. What there is cash businesses that operate on the very fringe, and anything that, not fringe of legality, that's not what I'm saying. Is that lunch? Is lunch ready? Anyway, so they're the ones most impacted by any downturn in the economy. Black first, then Hispanic, then Asian, then white. And so all these people are bootstrapping themselves, can't bootstrap themselves because they fight this wall of regulation and licensing that did not exist 50 years ago. But what it does is entrench existing businesses and prevent competition by others.
Yeah, well, those with support systems, with support structures, be it family, friends, business contacts, access to loans, to lines of credit, those people can survive. People who work on cash business, whose businesses have to go month to month, cannot. And that's the difference between people who are poor and trying to pick themselves up and those who are, like you said, already established or have a large support system to draw on. And those with the large support systems have been doing well and surviving, and those with not have been going by the wayside. And that is our time for today, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. We here at Libertarian Counterpoint want to thank you for joining us. You can find us at libertariancounterpoint.com. You can find us on all our social media outlets and on the podcast networks. Just look up Libertarian Counterpoint. And from all of us here, please remember to love everybody.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, Gail, for cutting out a couple of cuss words from 3 shows ago. I really appreciate it. Without